"We don't owe you anything," my son said across the dinner table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask him to repeat it. I simply looked down at my plate, folded my napkin, and stood up. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from." I want to know how far this story travels. The dining room was quiet after that. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of every small sound. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the wall clock, the scrape of a chair leg as I pushed mine back. I had cooked for hours that afternoon. A roast, mashed potatoes, green beans with butter. His favorite meal, the one I used to make when he came home from school hungry and tired. I was 71 years old, standing in the same house where I had once rocked him to sleep with one arm while paying bills with the other. The same house where I learned how to stretch $20 into a week's worth of groceries. The same kitchen where I cried quietly at night so he wouldn't hear me. My son didn't stop me as I walked away. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look surprised. That hurt more than the words. I washed my hands slowly at the sink, staring at my reflection in the window above it. My hair had gone completely gray over the past few years. Deep lines framed my mouth now. They weren't from smiling. They were from holding things in, from choosing patience when anger would have been easier, from choosing love when walking away would have been safer. I remembered when his father died. A sudden heart attack. No warning, no goodbye. Just a phone call in the middle of the night and a life split cleanly in two. Overnight, I became everything. Mother, father, provider, protector. There was no time to fall apart. There was a child who needed breakfast, clean clothes, and reassurance that everything would somehow be okay. So I worked. 2 jobs at first, sometimes 3. I measured my life in hours and miles, how far the bus ride was, how long my shifts lasted, how many steps it took to walk home when I couldn't afford the fare. I learned to fix things myself. Leaky faucets, broken locks, worn shoes. I learned what could wait and what couldn't. What never waited was my son. I gave him everything I had, not just money, time, energy, youth. I missed birthdays of my own. I stopped buying things for myself. I told myself it didn't matter. That one day, he would understand. That one day he would look back and see what it cost. Now he was grown, comfortable, confident, sitting at my table, telling me he owed me nothing. I picked up my purse from the counter and checked that my keys were inside. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I thought they would shake. I thought my chest would tighten. Instead, there was a strange calm settling in, like the quiet after a long storm. As I walked toward the hallway, I heard laughter behind me. Not cruel laughter. Casual, as if nothing important had just been said, as if nothing important had just ended. I paused at the doorway and took one last look at the room. The framed photos on the wall. My son at 5, missing a front tooth. At 12, holding a science fair ribbon. At 18, standing taller than me for the first time. I had been there for all of it. Every version of him. He didn't follow me. I opened the front door and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The porch light flickered on automatically, the same way it had for decades. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the night settle around me. That was the moment I understood something I had avoided for years. Love given without limits doesn't always come back as love. Sometimes it comes back as entitlement. The house felt different after the funeral. Not emptier, quieter. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes you notice things you used to ignore. The ticking clock in the hallway. The faint creak of the floorboards when I walked from room to room. The hum of the heater kicking on and off at night. Sounds that reminded me I was alone now, even when other people were in the house. My husband had been gone for 6 weeks. 6 weeks since I stood in the rain at the cemetery, holding a folded umbrella and wondering how a life could end so quickly. 1 minute he was reaching for his coffee mug. The next, he was gone. No dramatic final words. No time to prepare. Just absence. I moved through the days on habit alone. I woke up at the same time every morning, made coffee for 2 before remembering I only needed 1 cup. I still set his place at the table some mornings without thinking. A plate, a fork, a napkin. Then I would pause, stare at the empty chair, and quietly put everything back. My son had been polite after the funeral. That was the word for it. Polite. He asked if I needed anything. He checked in once or twice. He spoke to me the way people speak to strangers they don't want to offend. Gone was the warmth, the easy conversation, the way he used to sit at the counter and talk while I cooked. Now, everything felt scheduled, measured, as if my grief had an expiration date. The house itself still carried my husband's presence. His jacket hung by the door. His shoes sat neatly where he'd left them. The faint scent of his aftershave lingered in the bathroom. I couldn't bring myself to move any of it. Not yet. I spent my afternoons cleaning things that were already clean, wiping down counters, folding towels that didn't need folding, rearranging drawers just to keep my hands busy. Grief doesn't always look like crying. Sometimes it looks like restlessness, like trying to outrun memories inside your own home. Meals became the hardest part of the day. I cooked out of habit, not hunger. Large portions, familiar recipes, food made for a family, not for one older woman eating alone. Even when my son and his wife came over, I cooked the same way. Too much. As if I were afraid that cooking less would somehow make everything feel final. They ate quickly, spoke little, left early. I told myself it was stress, that people didn't always know how to behave around loss. I made excuses for the silences, for the way conversations ended abruptly when I entered the room, for the way decisions about the house, about plans, about the future, seemed to happen without me. I told myself I was imagining it. At night, I sat in the living room with the lights low, watching old television shows I barely followed. My thoughts wandered back to the years when my son was small, when the world felt heavy, but my purpose was clear, when everything I did was for him. I wondered when that version of me had stopped mattering. I wondered when love had turned into something conditional. Somewhere between grief and routine, I felt it happening. Not all at once, slowly, like a door closing without a sound. I was still there, still breathing, still present, but no longer centered. I didn't realize yet what that would cost them. I only knew that something fundamental had shifted, and there was no going back to the way things were. The changes didn't happen all at once. They slipped in quietly, disguised as small things. Easy things to ignore if you weren't paying attention. And for a while, I wasn't. I told myself I was tired. That grief made people imagine patterns that weren't really there. But patterns have a way of repeating themselves. My son stopped looking me in the eye when he spoke to me. Not every time, just often enough that I noticed. Conversations became shorter. Answers clipped. When I asked simple questions, what time they were coming over, whether they'd be home for dinner, he'd say, "We'll see," and never follow up. His wife started rearranging the house without asking. At first, it was harmless. A vase moved from the coffee table to the shelf. A stack of mail relocated from the counter to a drawer. Then it became more deliberate. Cabinets reorganized. Items shifted into boxes labeled storage. My storage, I assumed. Until I realized the boxes weren't going into the basement. They were going into the garage. One afternoon, I came home from a doctor's appointment and found my favorite chair pushed into a corner of the living room. The lamp beside it was gone. That chair had been there for years. It was where I sat every evening, where my husband used to bring me tea. I asked about it casually, lightly. "Oh," my daughter-in-law said, not looking up from her phone. "We needed more space." We. That word lingered longer than it should have. They began having conversations without me. Not quietly, not secretly, just as if I weren't part of the equation. I would walk into a room and the talking would stop. A glance would be exchanged. A subject changed. Once I overheard my son say, "We'll tell her later." He didn't sound cruel, just efficient. Later never came. My name disappeared from things too, from group texts, from plans, from discussions about repairs and finances. When I asked about a bill that hadn't arrived, my son said, "Oh, we're handling that now." When I asked what handling meant, he shrugged. "Don't worry about it." That was new. For decades I had worried about everything. Rent, groceries, tuition, doctor visits, broken appliances. Now suddenly I was being told not to worry at all. As if concern were no longer my place. The house no longer felt like mine. Doors were closed more often. My footsteps seemed louder. Out of place. I caught myself hesitating before entering rooms I had once walked into freely. I started spending more time in my bedroom, the only space that hadn't been quietly claimed. Even there, things began to shift. My closet felt smaller. Some of my clothes were folded differently, stacked tightly, as if making room for something else. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. But at night, lying awake, I replayed moments in my head. The way my son spoke for me when others asked questions. The way decisions were made quickly, without pause, without my input. The way my presence felt inconvenient. I wasn't angry yet. I was confused. Confusion is a dangerous thing. It makes you doubt yourself, makes you question your own memory, your own worth. I wondered if I had imagined my role in this family, if I had overstayed it without realizing. Then I remembered something my husband used to say, "Pay attention when people stop asking." That was when I understood. They weren't drifting away, they were moving forward, without me. I found his letters while cleaning out the hallway drawer. Not because I was looking for them. I was searching for batteries. The drawer had always been a mess. Old manuals, rubber bands, mismatched keys. Things my husband insisted we might need one day. I pulled everything out slowly, laying it on the table, sorting without much thought. That was when I saw the envelope. My name was written on the front in his handwriting. Careful, slightly slanted, the way it always was. Inside were several folded pages, yellowed at the edges, letters he had written during the first years after his diagnosis when he still believed he had time. I sat down and read them one by one. He wrote about me, about my strength, about how he worried what would happen after he was gone. He wrote that everything we built together was meant to protect me, not burden me, that I should never feel like a guest in my own home. "You earned this life," he wrote. "No one gets to tell you otherwise." I held those pages for a long time. Memories came back in pieces. Quiet moments. Ordinary ones. My husband standing between me and raised voices when our son was younger. The way he always asked my opinion before making decisions, even small ones. The way he said, "We decide together," as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I realized how much of that protection had disappeared with him. I started noticing things I had brushed aside before. Conversations that ended when I entered the room. Plans made quickly, efficiently, without pause. I remembered my son's expression at dinner the night he said those words. Not angry, not emotional. Resolved. The letters stayed with me after that. In my purse, on my nightstand. I read them when the house felt especially quiet. They reminded me of who I had been before I started shrinking to fit into spaces that no longer welcomed me. One afternoon, I overheard my daughter-in-law on the phone in the kitchen. "I don't think she realizes yet," she said, lowering her voice. "But it's better this way. She doesn't need to be involved." I stood in the hallway, unseen. Better for whom, I wondered. That night, I lay awake thinking about all the years I had spent anticipating other people's needs. Making room, adjusting, waiting for the right moment to speak. I had done it as a wife, as a mother, as a widow trying not to be a burden. I thought about the drawer, about the letters, about the promises my husband had made and trusted me to remember. Something settled in me then. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. I began paying closer attention, not to their words, but to their actions. Who signed what? Who paid what? Who assumed authority without asking? I stopped interrupting, stopped correcting. I listened. They mistook my silence for acceptance. In the days that followed, I revisited old habits. Not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. I gathered documents, deeds, bank statements, papers we had organized years ago and never needed to touch again. I moved slowly, carefully. The way I had learned to do everything when my son was small and resources were limited. No one noticed. They were too busy moving forward, convinced I was behind them. But I wasn't behind. I was remembering. And once you remember who you are, it becomes very difficult for anyone else to decide that for you. The shift became clearer once I stopped trying to be included. I noticed how my daughter-in-law spoke when she thought I wasn't listening. Not openly unkind, just precise. Controlled. She spoke about me the way people speak about furniture they plan to replace. Not with anger, but with calculation. "She doesn't really need that room," she said one evening. "She won't use the car much anyway. She'll be fine with less. Less space. Less say. Less presence." My son rarely disagreed. When he did, it wasn't on my behalf. It was about timing, about convenience, about how to make things easier for them. I realized then that loyalty doesn't disappear loudly. It fades quietly, until one day you look up and find yourself standing alone in a conversation that no longer includes you. A few days later, My sister came by unannounced. She had known me longer than anyone else alive. She took one look at me and said nothing at first. Just hugged me tightly and held on longer than usual. We sat at the kitchen table with cups of coffee growing cold between us. "You don't look settled," she said finally. I didn't argue. I didn't defend them. I just listened. She told me things I hadn't heard. Conversations she'd overheard at family gatherings. Assumptions my son and his wife had made aloud, as if they were already decided facts. Plans about the house, about my future, about what would happen eventually. They spoke as if I were temporary, as if my presence were a phase to be managed. My sister reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "They think you won't push back," she said quietly. "They think you'll accept whatever they decide." I didn't respond right away. That night, I sat alone in my room, the letters from my husband folded neatly beside me. I reread his words, slowly, carefully. I thought about all the times I had chosen peace over confrontation. All the times I had softened my needs so others could feel comfortable. There is a cost to that kind of love. The next morning, I did something different. I stopped explaining myself. When asked simple questions, I answered briefly. When decisions were mentioned, I listened without comment. I smiled politely. I nodded. I allowed them to believe everything was moving smoothly. They took that as approval. My daughter-in-law relaxed. My son stopped checking in altogether. The tension eased, not because things were better, but because they believed there would be no resistance. They mistook my quiet for surrender. But surrender requires giving something up. I was doing the opposite. In the days that followed, I moved through the house with intention. I observed routines, timelines, who left first in the morning, who handled which bills. I made note of what was said and what was assumed. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was reclaiming awareness. There is power in being underestimated. They believed I was tired, worn down, grateful for whatever I was given. They believed my silence meant agreement. They were wrong. For the first time since my husband died, I felt steady, not because I was supported, but because I had stopped waiting to be. I understood now that the role they had assigned me was one I never agreed to play. And when you recognize that, truly recognize it, you stop asking for permission to exist. You begin preparing to stand on your own terms. The first time I pushed back, it was barely noticeable. That was intentional. It happened over something small, a doctor's appointment. My daughter-in-law mentioned casually that my son would drive me because it worked better for everyone. She said it as a statement, not a question. "I already arranged my own ride," I replied. Her eyes flicked up, surprised. Just for a second, then she smiled. "Oh, okay." That was all. No argument. No explanation. I didn't justify myself. I didn't soften it. I simply stated a fact and moved on. The moment passed, but something in the air shifted. I felt it. So did she. After that, I chose my moments carefully. When mail arrived, I picked it up myself. When a bill was mentioned, I said I'd already reviewed it. When plans were discussed, I listened without inserting myself, without asking where I fit. They began to hesitate. Not enough to stop, just enough to notice. One afternoon, my son asked if I was feeling all right. His tone was neutral, but his eyes searched my face longer than usual. "I'm fine," I said. And I was. For the first time in months, my sleep improved. Not because things were peaceful, but because I wasn't fighting myself anymore. I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head. I wasn't trying to guess what would make everyone else comfortable. I woke up early each morning and moved through the house quietly. Not timidly, deliberately. I sorted papers, organized folders, labeled envelopes. I didn't rush. I didn't hide what I was doing. No one asked. They assumed I was keeping busy. There was a strange relief in that assumption, in being overlooked. It gave me room, space to think, space to remember how capable I had always been. I had raised a child alone, managed a household on a tight budget, survived loss that would have broken other people. This was not unfamiliar territory. One evening I declined dinner. "I already ate," I said. It wasn't true, but it wasn't a lie either. I had fed myself in other ways. Quiet walks, long showers, silence. I learned how much energy I had wasted explaining myself to people who weren't listening. My daughter-in-law stopped making suggestions. She started making observations instead. "She seems busy lately. She's doing her own thing." My son nodded along, relieved, I think. It was easier this way. No tension, no confrontation, just distance disguised as harmony. They didn't realize distance works both ways. I stopped waiting for invitations, stopped hovering near conversations, stopped positioning myself to be useful. I reclaimed my time, not loudly, but consistently. One afternoon, as I passed through the living room, I overheard my daughter-in-law say, "She's been really independent lately." Independent. I almost smiled. They thought this was a phase. Something temporary. Something that would pass once I needed help again. They underestimated how much strength grows when it's no longer spent trying to be accepted. I wasn't testing them. I was testing myself. And each small boundary held, each quiet refusal, reminded me that I still had control over one very important thing, myself. They didn't see resistance. They saw compliance. That misunderstanding worked in my favor. Because while they relaxed, believing nothing had changed, I was becoming someone they no longer knew how to manage. And that was exactly the point. The conversation happened on a Sunday afternoon. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just the three of us sitting at the kitchen table, sunlight stretching across the worn wood surface like it always had. My son cleared his throat before he spoke. That should have warned me. "We've been talking," he said. "We." That word again. I nodded, waiting. He glanced at his wife, then back at me. "We think it might be time to start making some adjustments." I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask what kind. I folded my hands in my lap and listened the way I had taught him to listen when he was a child. "She's been under a lot of stress," my daughter-in-law added gently. Her tone was practiced, concerned, almost kind. "And with everything you've been through, it might be easier if responsibilities were simplified." Simplified? I asked one question. Just one. "What responsibilities?" There was a pause, a small one, but telling. "Managing things," my son said. "The house. Finances. Decisions. You shouldn't have to worry about all that anymore." I looked at him then. Really looked. This was the boy who used to sit at the same table doing homework while I cooked dinner. The boy who asked me how to write checks because he wanted to help. The boy who watched me balance accounts late at night and said, "You're really good at this, Mom." Now he was telling me I shouldn't worry about it at all. "I've managed just fine," I said. My daughter-in-law smiled tightly. "Of course, but things change." That was when he said it. "We don't owe you anything." The words landed softly, almost politely, as if they had been rehearsed, as if he expected them to end the discussion. I didn't gasp, I didn't flinch, I didn't ask him to explain. I nodded once. "I see," I said. He looked relieved. His shoulders relaxed, he thought it was over. But something had shifted. Not outwardly. Inside me. That sentence reached further back than he realized. Further than this house. Further than this moment. It reached into years of scraped knees, late-night fevers, missed meals, unpaid vacations, and quiet sacrifices no one had ever witnessed. I stood up and gathered my cup from the table. "I'm going to rest," I said. "It's been a long day." No one stopped me. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. There was no surge of emotion demanding release. There was clarity. He believed love was a transaction. That what I gave was optional. That what he received required no acknowledgement. That belief told me everything I needed to know. Later that evening, I heard them laughing in the living room. A television show. Something light. Something forgettable. Life continuing exactly as they expected it to. They thought that conversation had closed a door. They didn't realize it had opened one. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. Not because I felt supported, but because I finally understood where I stood. And once you know that, you stop standing in the wrong places, waiting to be invited in. You start choosing where you belong, even if that place is apart from the people who believe they owe you nothing. The days after that conversation moved slowly, not awkwardly, not tensely, just quietly, like everything had settled into a new arrangement no one bothered to announce. They acted as if nothing important had happened. My son greeted me the same way each morning, polite, brief. My daughter-in-law continued with her routines, moving through the house with confidence, speaking as if decisions had already been agreed upon. I let them. I didn't revisit the words. I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't bring it up again. Instead, I paid attention. I noticed how easily they assumed my availability, how they discussed schedules as if mine no longer existed, I noticed how my presence had become background noise, a constant but not essential. There was relief in that. When people stop watching you closely, they stop seeing what you're doing. I began spending more time outside the house, long walks in the late afternoon. Errands that took longer than necessary, sitting on benches with no destination in mind. I enjoyed the anonymity of it. No expectations, no roles to perform. At home, I moved with purpose. I sorted through drawers I hadn't opened in years, not in a rush, one at a time. I reread documents I had once skimmed and trusted. I made lists, then rewrote them. Dates, names, details that mattered. I didn't hide anything. There was no need. My daughter-in-law commented once lightly, "You've been very busy lately." "Yes," I said. "I have." She smiled, satisfied. Busy meant distracted. Busy meant not interfering. Busy meant harmless. They mistook my calm for resignation. In the evenings, I sat alone more often. Not out of loneliness, but choice. I stopped lingering in shared spaces, stopped offering commentary, stopped volunteering opinions that would go unheard anyway. It felt cleaner this way. Without the noise of constant adjustment, my thoughts sharpened. I remembered things I had set aside for years, skills I had relied on before there was anyone else to lean on. I remembered that I had survived much worse than being dismissed. I remembered that I had rebuilt a life from nothing once already. One afternoon, my son asked if I was upset. "No," I said, and it was true. Upset requires hope. It requires the belief that something could still be fixed. What I felt now was different. It was acceptance without surrender. He nodded, relieved. The question had been for his benefit, not mine. They believed the situation was resolved. I believed it was clarified. That difference mattered. At night, I slept without replaying conversations in my head, without rehearsing explanations. I no longer needed them to understand. I understood enough. I watched them relax, watched the tension drain from their shoulders, watched them move forward with confidence, certain they had established control. Control is fragile when it's based on assumptions. They assumed I needed them. They assumed I would stay quiet. They assumed my silence meant agreement. Silence, I learned, can mean many things. Sometimes it means listening, sometimes it means remembering, and sometimes it means preparing. They had drawn their line with words. I was drawing mine with actions, and the space between those two lines was growing wider each day. Looking back, I could trace the pattern clearly. It hadn't started with cruelty. It had started with convenience. I remembered the early years after my husband died, how quickly responsibility fell on my shoulders, how naturally it stayed there. I learned to stretch meals, to mend clothes, to fix what broke because there was no one else to do it. I learned to be quiet about my exhaustion because there was no room for weakness. My son never saw most of it. He saw dinners on the table, clean shirts, school forms signed on time. He saw consistency, not cost. Children rarely understand what stability requires. They only notice when it's gone. As he grew older, my sacrifices became invisible, not because they stopped mattering, but because they were expected. Love delivered without conditions has a way of becoming background noise. I remembered the nights I stayed up balancing bills so he could join school trips without worry. The weekends I skipped rest to work extra shifts. The choices I didn't question because there was always something more important than myself. I never kept score. I thought love didn't need an audience. Now, sitting alone in my room, I understood something I hadn't before. Love without boundaries doesn't just exhaust the giver. It confuses the receiver. It teaches them that effort appears automatically, that care is endless, that gratitude is optional. I thought about how often I had stepped aside so others could feel comfortable, how often I had softened my words so no one felt challenged, how often I had accepted less so someone else could feel more. None of it had been demanded outright. I had offered it freely. That realization didn't bring regret. It brought clarity. I saw now that my son hadn't woken up one day and decided I meant nothing. He had simply grown up in a world where my presence was constant, reliable, and unchanging, like air. Necessary but unnoticed. When air is always there, people forget it can disappear. I thought about the way he said those words. Calm, certain, as if stating a fact. In his mind, he wasn't being cruel. He was setting a boundary he believed already existed. That boundary forced me to confront my own. For years, I had defined myself by what I provided, what I absorbed, what I endured. I had mistaken endurance for strength and silence for grace. I had believed that being needed was the same as being valued. They are not. Value remains even when you step back. Need disappears the moment someone believes they've replaced you. I didn't feel bitterness as I sorted through these memories. I felt distance, the kind that allows you to see the full shape of things without being swallowed by them. I had raised a son who believed independence meant separation, who believed love was something you grew out of. That belief didn't erase what I had done. It redefined what I would do next. I no longer wanted acknowledgement. I wanted alignment. With myself. That evening, I closed the drawer where I kept old photographs. I didn't need to revisit them again. They had served their purpose. They reminded me of who I had been and why I no longer needed to prove it. The past no longer asked anything of me, and for the first time, neither did my future. I wasn't rewriting my story. I was reclaiming it. I stopped asking to be included. Not dramatically, not all at once, just quietly in ways that felt almost invisible. I no longer waited for approval before making choices about my own time. If I wanted to leave the house, I left. If I wanted silence, I took it. I stopped adjusting my schedule around theirs, stopped hovering, stopped anticipating needs that were never spoken aloud. The relief surprised me. For years, my life had been shaped by responsiveness, by staying alert, by being ready. I had trained myself to listen for footsteps, for changes in tone, for unspoken expectations. Letting go of that constant readiness felt strange at first, like standing still after years of motion. But it also felt honest. I began to eat when I was hungry, not when dinner was served. I read in the afternoons instead of cleaning rooms that were already tidy. I made plans without announcing them. Simple things, ordinary things. Things I had postponed for so long they felt unfamiliar. No one objected. They barely noticed. That told me more than any argument could have. My son seemed calmer, less guarded. He assumed the tension had passed, that everything had settled into a manageable arrangement. My daughter-in-law smiled more often, comfortable in her belief that the difficult part was over. They thought distance meant peace. I understood that distance meant boundaries. One morning, I declined a request to babysit at short notice. Not because I was busy, because I didn't want to. I won't be able to, I said. There was a pause on the other end of the phone, not anger, confusion. Oh, my son said. Okay. No follow-up, no pressure. He adjusted. They always did. That was when I realized something important. They didn't need me the way I thought they did. They relied on my availability, not my presence. Once availability disappeared, they adapted without hesitation. That truth didn't hurt. It clarified. I stopped feeling responsible for outcomes that weren't mine. Stopped feeling guilty for choosing myself. I had spent decades believing love meant sacrifice without limits. I was learning that love also meant knowing when to stop giving. In the evenings, I sat by the window and watched the light change across the street. Neighbors came and went. Life continued, indifferent to my family's quiet shifts. There was comfort in that normalcy, in knowing the world didn't collapse when I stepped back. I thought about the woman I had been at 30, tired, determined, certain she could carry anything if she had to. That woman had done her job. She had raised a child, built a life, survived loss. She didn't owe anyone anything either. I wasn't withdrawing out of spite. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply done negotiating my worth. The house felt larger as I reclaimed my space within it. Not physically, emotionally. I no longer shrank my needs to avoid friction. I no longer softened my voice to be heard. I spoke plainly, or not at all. And when I wasn't included, I didn't ask why. I accepted it. Acceptance isn't defeat, it's release. By the end of that week, I understood something fundamental had changed. Not in them, in me. I had stopped waiting for validation from people who believed they owed me nothing. I had decided that I owed myself something instead. And that decision felt long overdue. I waited. Not passively, not impatiently, just long enough for assumptions to settle in. They grew comfortable in their certainty, comfortable believing the arrangement had stabilized, that I had accepted my place quietly, without resistance. My son moved through the house with ease again. My daughter-in-law spoke freely, confident nothing would interrupt her plans. That confidence created space. One afternoon, while the house was empty, I sat at the dining table with a folder spread neatly in front of me. Papers I had gathered over days, deeds, statements. Documents my husband and I had organized years ago, long before any of this seemed necessary. I read everything carefully, not emotionally, methodically. I remembered my husband insisting we keep copies of everything. Just in case, he'd said. I had smiled then, thinking it was unnecessary caution. Now it felt like foresight. I made calls, quiet ones. Asked simple questions. Listened closely to the answers. I didn't explain my situation, I didn't dramatize, I just verified facts. The information settled into place quickly. Nothing had been taken yet. Nothing had been signed away. Nothing was irreversible. That mattered. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't hint. I didn't warn. I continued as I had been, calm, reserved, agreeable. I let them believe time was working in their favor. Time was working in mine. I updated things that needed updating, not out of fear, but clarity. I ensured my wishes were documented plainly, that my voice existed where it mattered most, on paper, not in conversation. I didn't remove anyone. I didn't make threats. I simply made things precise. There is a difference. When my daughter-in-law mentioned future plans casually, ideas about space, about logistics, I nodded and changed the subject. She took that as approval. I let her. Approval wasn't required. I wasn't reclaiming control out of anger. I was reclaiming it because it was always mine to begin with. I had just forgotten that for a while. One evening, my son commented that I seemed lighter. "You've been in good spirits," he said. I smiled. I feel settled. That was true. I felt grounded in a way I hadn't in years. Not because circumstances had improved, but because I had stopped pretending I didn't see what was happening. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits patiently, observing, while others speak too freely. They believed the future was already decided. I knew better. Nothing outward changed that week. Meals were eaten, doors opened and closed, conversations remained surface level. But underneath, everything was different. I was no longer reacting. I was positioned. And once you reach that point, once you understand where you stand and what you hold, you don't need to raise your voice to be heard. You just need to stop giving access to what was never meant to be taken for granted. They thought silence meant surrender. They didn't realize it was preparation. The house was quiet the morning I decided to leave. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just quietly, the way everything important in my life had happened. I woke before sunrise, as I often did, and sat at the edge of the bed, listening to the familiar sounds. The heater clicked on. A car passed outside. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and stopped. The world was moving, indifferent and steady. I dressed slowly, choosing clothes that felt like mine. Not practical, not apologetic, just comfortable. I folded the letters from my husband one last time and placed them back where they belonged. They had carried me far enough. In the kitchen, the table was clean, no plates set, no expectations waiting. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window while it cooled, watching the light creep across the floor. No one asked where I was going. No one needed to. My suitcase sat by the door, small and unremarkable. It didn't carry much. I had learned long ago that you don't need to take everything with you to move forward. Some things stay behind because they've already done their work. Before leaving, I walked through the house once more, not to say goodbye, just to acknowledge it. The walls, the corners, the places where I had once made myself smaller to keep peace. I felt no anger, no resentment, only distance. My son emerged from the hallway as I reached for my coat. He looked surprised, not alarmed, just caught off guard. "Are you going somewhere?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded, unsure what to add. There was a pause, an opening. He didn't step into it. I opened the door and stepped outside. The air was cool, clean. It filled my lungs easily. I stood there for a moment, grounded, aware of my feet on the porch, my hand on the rail. I hadn't felt this present in a long time. As I walked down the steps, I thought about the words he had said. "We don't owe you anything." He was right, in a way. Love isn't a debt. Sacrifice isn't an invoice. No one owes another human gratitude. But love is a choice, and so is distance. I didn't leave to teach a lesson. I didn't leave to be missed. I left because staying had required me to disappear, and leaving allowed me to remain. I found a small place of my own, quiet, sunlit, mine. I arranged it slowly, deliberately, each item chosen, each space respected. There was peace in deciding where things belonged without needing permission. Some evenings I still think of my son, of the boy he was, of the man he became. I wish him well without needing anything in return. I no longer wait for acknowledgement. I no longer measure my worth by how useful I am to others. I raised a child. I loved deeply. I gave fully. That chapter is complete. The rest of my life belongs to me. And for the first time in a long while, that feels like enough.